Welcome to today's webinar, Geodesign Using Data Transparency and Community Voices for Enhanced Land Use Planning, hosted by the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network and is partially funded by the U.S. EPA Office of Community Revitalization and is managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars such as today's, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website, smartgrowth.org, your one-stop on the web for the most current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. We provide timely news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Clearinghouse on smart growth topics, available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We're recording this webinar and will post it on our website in the next few days under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest news and information about smart growth and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your CM credits, visit the APA's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Geodesign, Using Data Transparency and Community Voices for Enhanced Land Use Planning. You can also search for event number 9177104. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. So to get started today, our speakers are Kelleann Foster, David Goldberg, and Jesse Suders. Kelleann Foster, RLA, ASLA, is a licensed landscape architect, professor in Penn State's Landscape Architecture Department, and director of the Stuckman School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture. She is author of the book Becoming a Landscape Architect, published by John Wiley & Sons as part of their Careers in Design series. A recent sabbatical at Esri resulted in the development of Penn State's online geodesign graduate programs. Much of her professional and research work uses computer technologies to communicate alternative scenarios to citizens. Her work has received national and international recognition. David Goldberg, ASLA, is an assistant professor of landscape architecture and the technology operations manager at the Stuckman School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at Penn State. He teaches courses in design visualization, building information modeling, site design, and geodesign. His research interests include optimizing the physical and virtual environments where teams interact, enhancing interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaboration between industry practice and the academy, and developing strategies for virtual learning environments for studio design courses. Jesse Suders, a community and economic development planner with Tetra Tech, has 10 years of geographic information systems and planning experience. He works to ensure that geospatial data and technology are utilized to their maximum potential by supporting a variety of planning projects at the state, regional, and local scales. With experiences ranging from conservation planning to Department of Defense encroachment studies, Mr. Suders' wide range of experience have helped to inform his implementation of geodesign methodologies, geospatial technologies, and modern planning theory by allowing him to develop holistic and unique solutions to complex design problems. Following the presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during the presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Kelleann to get us started. Welcome, Kelleann.
Okay, good afternoon. Hello. I guess it might be good morning for some of you, depending on where you are. Let's see if we can get this to, there we go. Okay. Yes, we are very excited to share with you about geodesign and how you can use data transparency and community voices in your efforts out there at land use planning. And as Michael mentioned, we've got 3 of us lined up here. I'm going to go first, followed by David Goldberg, and then also Jesse will follow at the end. All 3 of us have an association with Penn State. Both, obviously, David and I are faculty there, and Jesse graduated last year with his master's in professional studies in geodesign from Penn State. So our outline for this afternoon, I'm going to introduce you to geodesign. And even though we're going to definitely take questions at the end, this is a long session, so we didn't want to have you have pent-up demand for your questions. So we're going to take a couple of questions at the end of each of the first 2 sections, and then at the very end we'll have more questions. So in other words, we really want this to be an engaged, interactive, I guess, afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Okay, so why geodesign, you might be asking? I wonder if you know of these books or know of these men. So McHarg and Lewis were at the forefront of using land information for planning and design for quite a while. So geodesign actually stands on their shoulders. And so we have 50 years ago now is when Design with Nature was published. So at the 50-year mark. At that time, when McHarg wrote it, he really challenged the status quo for design and planning. It altered how we're proposing new methods. So he altered how we work by proposing new methods and to provoke innovation in spatial and ecological futures. And Tomorrow by Design is now nearly 25 years old. So one of the key reasons why geodesign is to carry on the great work of these 2 innovative designers and planners and advance their ideas through the use of these dynamic new technologies and refinement of their processes. Oops, I forgot to, why am I not having, let's see here if I can, there we go. Okay, push the right buttons to show 25 years for Phil Lewis. So I think it's important to clarify that geodesign is not GIS. In fact, it's been called, excuse me, the 4th wave of GIS evolution. Bill Miller, who talked about this, he said there were really initially 3 major segments of GIS technologies. One is that you have data with maps that bind and secure and enable you to use that data. So initially the focus was on developing databases. As that was realized, it migrated to the 2nd segment, which involved analysis and feature processing. So geography is analyzed for various purposes and reasons. The 3rd segment then is design, and that's the most recent. Once you have that data and analyze it for a purpose, then you do creative work with all of that analysis. And I think Bill would agree with me that there's actually a 4th wave, which is really engaging folks to help better understand the potential consequences of those creative ideas via real-time dashboards and interactive graphics, which we're going to show you as we move into this presentation. So the use of geospatial data to explore these impacts on different design ideas, that's really at the heart of geodesign. So why geodesign? Also, it's these geospatial technologies are continuing to evolve. There's more and more powerful and data-rich tools, and now we can model all sorts of processes and values and then explore outcomes as we've never been able to do before. And as you can see, this little video is running here. We can display choices and implications in real time as we're working with communities. So we did a recent hashtag #WhyIGeodesign to get some feedback from folks and understand why people are using geodesign. So I'm going to read a few quotes. The first one here is to stay relevant in an ever-evolving world. So they're applying the principles of geodesign, and it helps to get your ideas across to stakeholders, and importantly, reduces that divide between designers and planners and stakeholders. Another quote is to overcome the challenges of managing this rapid urban growth. So if you have faster plan iterations, it means you can explore more design scenarios and analyze more scenarios at the same time. Oh, goodness. Here we go. Back to this. Okay. Geodesign's engagement strategy being it's place-based and people-driven and data-informed. It's pretty revolutionary in planning today, and it fundamentally challenges people to think differently, and it's really yielding exciting results. I'm embellishing on that quote there. And the last quote I'll share with you is, geodesign offers a transparent process to discover and illustrate client values. That's really important, this idea of transparency in generating planning and design alternatives. And this leads to trust and client satisfaction and profit. So then what is geodesign? It is a design process, and it's actually filling that gap between design and approaches we take with design and science. And so people to place, this is a image here from Carl Steinitz, the cover is Carl Steinitz's book, A Framework for Geodesign, placing people of the place kind of at the top of this diagram. And that's very deliberate because decisions are the major factor in this process. People have to make decisions, and this is a decision-driven process. So it's a recognized design and planning process that combines people, technology, as well as the place where you're rooted, where you are, where the challenge is. So this afternoon, we're going to focus on how designers and planners can augment their typical approaches through geodesign. This is a Venn diagram. It's showing geodesign at the center, and it illustrates connection points to several facets of planning and design, which you will all recognize, and they're all arrayed around the edges. So this diagram highlights the strengths of all the parts. So really, if you will, geodesign's kind of secret sauce is that it brings together science in this form of, in the form of geospatial data, and along with many consultants and stakeholders in a collaborative geodesign process. So in a few minutes, David's going to review this geodesign process in more detail. So this is a graphic we created for Penn State's geodesign programs, and even though it's a little abstract, it actually creatively hints at several key aspects of geodesign. First is that geodesign helps the community develop sustainable solutions, and they're also based in the place. So that's represented by the green backdrop and also that little orange biking icon there in the middle. Second is geodesign is a planning design process that reveals a desired appropriate solution. So hence we've used kind of a bullseye metaphor there on the right side of the diagram. Also, geodesign, key to geodesign is that it evaluates and measures design impacts. And that's represented by the little bar chart imposed over the base graphic, and actually the different color coding on the plan in the middle ring. And lastly, geodesign is really quite complex. So locations as diverse as cities, all the way to very rural regions, can all be addressed with geodesign. This means it's not really easily represented by a single image of a place or of a design. So this graphic then seeks to include both an aerial view of the farms on the left, as well as in the outer ring of the bullseye there, a 3D of an urban environment. So I want to briefly address why it's so important today and for our future that we look into geodesign and start using this. So we've actually really crossed the threshold here. We're now living in a data-rich world, one in which this data is increasingly more accessible. So last year, the CEO of Intel suggested that bits and bytes will replace petroleum as a primary fuel for the world's economy. So in relation to design and planning, there's a growing chorus forecasting that design can no longer be separated from data. There are, however, still many who underestimate the power and potential of engaging and using that data. So the role of gathering and understanding information about a place has always been a hallmark of what we do as planners and landscape architects, right? But the way that information, which I'm going to call data, can be acquired is constantly evolving. Additionally, the quantity and types of data available are growing, and some even refer to this as like a fire hose of this stuff coming at us, right? It's kind of crazy. So the wide range of physical, biological, phenomenological, cultural, economic data, those have always been at the root of the work that we do. But that's now expanding, and it's now joined by social data, personal health data, real-time data and tracking, and learning or experiential data. And all that can be used in the service of geodesign. However, not all data is going to be useful to your project at hand. You've probably heard the term big data, right? And that means it's data that's large in volume, variety, speed or velocity, and value. So this means we can find reams of data available about a project location. However, not all that data is going to be equally relevant or viable to what we are trying to address. So Dr. Steinitz, one of the originators of geodesign, he maintains that you have to first clearly understand and articulate your problem and the values of the community, and then you will be able to determine what data is going to be best suited to assist in that the geodesign process. So figuring out what data you truly need is just an essential part. It's key to the geodesign success. So some really helpful guidance about data can be useful to advancing that desired outcome for a community. So we've got some really great, fairly recent guidance from the American Planning Association. They published a report that targets designing healthy communities. And their express goal in putting out this publication is to outline consistent metrics that can be used across diverse communities. And they further state that they wish to provide actionable guidance that's workable and inclusive. I'm just going to pull a couple examples from this to show you what I'm talking about here. The report outlines built environment assessment indicators or metrics for 5 domains considered critical to community health. We've got active living, healthy food system, environmental exposure, emergency preparedness, and social cohesion. So here's just one example. These are the metrics for the healthy food system domain. Note that the built environment assessment indicators, that's the column in the middle there, this is what provides a guide as to what data you might want to get in order to design and plan for this outcome goal of creating a healthy food system within your community. So I'm not sure if you can read this, how well you can read this, so I'll point out a couple of them. So the first one, the first little square there, checkpoint, is the percentage of low-income population that's not within a walkable distance of a full-service grocery store. That's definitely data you can get, you can map, it's spatial. Corner stores that have healthy food options, density of fast food restaurants, these are all data that you can get and can be used in a geospatial way to assist as you're trying to address this, if this was your particular issue. So there's a urgent call out there for computer scientists and researchers to prioritize work on environmental sustainability topics. But I believe there also needs to be an urgent call for how best to sort out and use all of this data. Although there are many gaps in data, there's still plenty out there, and particularly there's gaps in the natural systems, there's still a really important need for expertise that can assist in advancing the use of this data for mutual benefit for humans and the natural world. And this, to me, is a very important role for designers and planners. We can channel our ability to empathize, to read and interpret context, and devise creative responses to complex problems. So the key here is to organize and track all these connection points between the data and what our goal is for those projects. And this is my last slide here. So this was taken this spring at a geodesign-based workshop here in Pennsylvania. The details may be hard to see, but there are, across the top, there are 6 initial concept scenarios for a land use. And below each is a bar chart illustrating impacts to the previously agreed upon criteria. And this was a real-time illustration of ideas that are tied to the what the community wants, what the impacts are. This was allowing everyone to see and compare and then eventually negotiate towards a desired outcome. So what geodesign is, the heart of geodesign is the fact that you want the values that are rooted in that place, articulated by the stakeholders and the decision makers. You combine that with the data relevant to those topics, and this can all become very transparent in helping people understand the choices, consequences, trade-offs they might need to make. And this is really proving to be a game changer for achieving desired results. So now we'd like to go ahead and take a few questions before moving on to David, to our next speaker. So I think, John, are you taking over and giving all of us?
Hey, Kelleann, it's Michael. So yes, we will pause here for just a couple questions for Kelleann, and then when David goes, if people do want to ask specific questions for him, we'll pause briefly before Jesse, and then the final half hour or so we'll do on Q&A generally for everybody. So just a couple questions for you, Kelleann. I guess to start, what do you think is the most challenging aspect when doing the geodesign process?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a really important question. It's finding the people. You've got to make sure How many of us have done plans and they end up sitting on shelves, right? Because they're not resonating, or they're not addressing, or people don't have buy-in. And so getting the right people who are stakeholders, you sometimes have to look under rocks to find these people, engaging them in multiple ways. Don't just expect they're going to be able to come to a meeting at a certain time, at a certain evening. That workshop, I just showed that last slide there. That was actually the the third phase of involving the community. We had done a survey that allowed anybody who got the link. So it was widely broadcast. It was open for many days. Then we also had a smaller subset group of stakeholders to go through some of the issues, and then this was a public one. So getting the right people to understand who's going to make the decision at the end, and involving the stakeholders. You notice I didn't say it's the technology. The technology is valuable, but it's not the be-all and end-all. If you don't get the right people at the table, sharing their concerns, finding out what the values are, the project won't be a success. So I don't know if David and Jesse, if you want to add anything onto that.
No, Kelleann, I think you covered, for me, I think you covered that essential question, and that is the people that need to be included in the process. I'll be talking about that a lot in my next part.
Okay. So Jesse's not unmuted, so I guess I don't know if he has any questions, but that's all right.
Okay. Well, why don't we go on to the next question then? Kelleann, so given that, how can geodesign support resiliency issues?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, that's part of it will be engaging the people and finding out what are those resiliency issues. And again, I'm hoping, can you unmute Jesse too? Because I think both of them might want to weigh on this too, because this is a broader. So there's a lot of issues for resiliency related to climate change issues, what we're dealing with on the land with flooding or stormwater, and being able to help people see what these, doing models that forecast what some of these impacts might be, and helping people explore what those alternatives to starting to address these issues might be. I don't know, David, did you want to add anything about resiliency?
Yeah, I think resiliency really starts to identify some of those external threats to a project or to an area, and to negotiate that as part of your design process. I mean, there are specific resiliency issues that may be in question. Perhaps it's riverine flooding that you need to mitigate or to plan for, or it could be other larger factors such as sea level rising or other coastal impacts.
And again, I thought we were going to unmute. So after David, make sure we unmute all three of us, if you guys will.
Just for everybody's purposes, Jesse, I think you need to do something on your end to be able to unmute.
We can't control you.
He'll need to enter a PIN that has been sent to him.
He did that earlier, but okay, he's got to do it again.
Didn't go through. Well, while he deals with that, why don't we move on with another question, and then we can move into David's portion. Just to ask you all, will geodesign work in places with limited technology and/or financial resources?
Oh yes, absolutely. So the idea of using the technology is I don't want to say newish. So Dr. Carl Steinitz has been using this geodesign process and refined it for over 40 years. And he started before computers were as robust as they were. And in fact, he still works in places that don't have good computer connections. And he uses acetate overlays, kind of harkening back to the original McCargian methods. So you can do this without the technology. You won't be able to explore as deep or as quickly. But it's what we're talking about here is a process that's enhanced by the technology, but it doesn't limit you. And as far as limited financial resources, if you want to get people together in a room and print out some maps and work from there, the key is asking the right questions and getting them to articulate what their concerns are and what the issues are. We actually, our students do some work in Tanzania, which is doesn't have a lot of the technology available to them and a lot of financial resources, and they're still able to have successful results. So I don't know, David and Jesse, if you want to weigh in. I see Jesse, you're on.
Yeah,
so.
I'm back on, but I didn't hear the question.
The question was, how well can you work in places with limited financial resources and I think limited technology? Was that it? Something like that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I can actually speak to that pretty well. So, you know, a lot of times with the resiliency projects, we come in, they're for smaller towns that say you maybe have a small rural Pennsylvania town that's experienced flooding, has a lot of severe repetitive loss properties, and they don't have a huge budget. They've maybe gotten a small grant to do a project, and we come in and we look to incorporate some level of technology into the process. And a lot of times people think, well, the client's not going to pay for it, they can't afford it. And the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of technologies out there that are extremely affordable, that create a geodesign atmosphere, or a technology enhanced atmosphere. So one of those is ArcGIS Online, and simply, rather than doing a sticky dot map exercise, you work dynamically with the community to draw in, say, lines of connectivity, which, connectivity increases the resiliency of a community, creates capacity. So you could do that dynamically in front of the group. Another way, you can build in technology on a small budget is there's a lot of internet-based software packages out there, one of which I've used frequently is wiki mapping. And it's essentially a sticky dot map exercise, except it reduces the complexity of the project and helps to increase efficiency, and it's not expensive. And how it does that is you do a survey where people put a dot on a map, but instead of them putting a dot on a map that's a color and you correlate that to something and then you link that to a survey later, as they put a dot on the map, they actively are filling out a survey about that point. So it's a low-cost program. It increases efficiency by linking the point to the survey right away, and it increases your ability to synthesize the data in a more fluid manner, so it saves on project budget. So I hope those examples help maybe give some ideas and thoughts to how you could use it.
I'll add one more, and then we probably should move on to David's presentation to keep on time here. One of the things that ESRI, Esri, they've curated, because Jack Dangerman, the CEO, is very concerned about the environment. There's a whole bunch of maps and data available for free for anyone can use them. So there's a lot of, as Jesse said, there's a lot of low cost or free resources also available.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Kelleann, for setting this up. So I want to talk about the geodesign process. Now, what I'm going to talk about is a process. I'm right now adopting a framework from a framework for geodesign, which means it's a singular process, but there's other processes that you may adopt. So Dr. Carl Stein has developed a framework for geodesign that asks a geodesign team to answer 6 basic questions as they correspond to 6 models. Interestingly, he poses the same questions in 3 iterations in alternating order. I'm going to go through these in a couple case studies here. So he actually iterates these into 3 iterations, as you see here, and we're going to go through those questions. Now, both of these, both the representation models and change models talk about data. We are talking about data transparency here in Smart Growth. So I just want to call attention to both representation and change models are addressing data. Now, in the first iteration, the scoping, why the study area should happen, is really going through this process in the first iteration, going through these models in a relatively quick manner to just scope the project. And so in the first iteration, the questions are, why should the study be needed? How should the study area be described? How does the study area operate? Is the current study area working well? How might the study area be altered? These are actually going through each model. So how might the study area be altered is a change model. What differences might the change cause? And these are the impacts. And how should the study area be changed? Ultimately, at the end of the scoping, you answer that question. How should it be changed? You're making assumptions all along the way. You don't have all that information yet. You're just kind of going through it in a quick way. And those assumptions, when you actually make assumption, it actually narrows the scope of that study. So in this first iteration, using a project by one of our students, he was looking at the Manitou Springs in Colorado. He looked at the representation models for, how should the study area be described. He looked at the information, the limits of the area, the geography. So some of the answers could be it's a historic town, it's built in a floodplain, it's sprawling growth, there's little stormwater management. So just general, questions or general answers about the place. How does the study area operate? Now, these are the process models. These are starting to look at process of this place. And now, generically, you can look at processes: environmental, social, and economic. Now, he looked at, flash flooding as a process, the property damage that's occurring, and the insurance claim. Both the property damage and insurance claim can be associated with the economics. Now, the evaluation models, moving down here now. Upper right here, we're actually going through these models. In the evaluation models, you ask the question, is the current study area working well? And this is, we're inferring that you've looked at the process models. And you can say, you know what? It's attractive, natural view sheds, there's historic buildings, there's some cultural activities occurring here, but there's some vulnerabilities that are happening in this area. So there's fire hazards. It's, again, flood prone, there's flood hazards, there's storms, we can look at an inventory and understand there's old storm sewer infrastructures, and there's traffic, lack of parking. So some of these are just understanding the place from the evaluation standpoint. Now we'll look at the changes. So you're asking the question in the scoping, how might the study area be altered? And you could generally say, there's businesses are closing or moving. You could have flood mitigation efforts to control those floodwaters. There may be efforts to redevelop this one is looking at the East Manitou Springs area. There's also, you may pull in, here it says phase 3 development improvements. If there are existing plans in place, this is kind of where you plug those into your scoping. What are the existing, some of the existing development scenarios that are being proposed? So this case is a phase 3 downtown improvements that are happening. And then there's also talk about raising the building limits, the FFE of your buildings that maybe be built above flood stages. Then you look at the impacts. What impacts might those differences that you just proposed in that scoping, what might they do? And you're going to look at both the harmful and beneficial impacts. So the harmful may be the risk of serious flooding, that results of the threat of life, property, and economic stability, decline in tax revenues, insurance rate hikes. Those might be some of the harmful impacts of some of those changes that were proposed. But what might be the beneficial impacts of those changes? Hopefully, you can promote a new development and attract new businesses, both downtown and into those east ends. And then you look at the decision model in the scoping here. How should the study area be changed? Given all that we just learned from that one during the scoping, you start to identify a problem statement. And maybe a problem statement for this project was, how might we improve the resilience problem of the Manitou Springs and its nearest neighbors, Old Colorado City and downtown Colorado Springs, Colorado being the place, by reducing flood risks, improving connectivities, and increasing economic diversity. So at the end of the scoping, we should have a question to pose as we move through the second iteration. Now, the second iteration in Steinnitz's framework is going in reverse order. And that reverse order is to help us specify the methods on how the study should happen. So we're in reverse order, we're going to ask the questions on the decision model. We're going to say, how will the decisions be made and by whom? The next is, which impacts of possible changes are most important? And this is thinking about those decision makers. What impacts or possible changes are most important to them? Who defines the assumptions and requirements for those changes, and how are they determined? And what what measures are for the evaluation? Now you're evaluating those impacts based on those changes, and which process model should be included. This is an important one to consider right now. Is we're talking about process models here, but we actually have to look at those impacts. So what processes of those changes? What processes of the impacts are most important here in our project to understand? So we're starting to narrow the scope even more here. And then ultimately, we're asking what data is needed for the study and how shall it be presented? Now, I'm going to focus on these two here for this next case study. So we're looking at both the decision makers and the evaluations in a study. Now, science actually pairs his models, and in our courses, we actually pair our models as well. So I'm going to go through a case study that we looked at in pairing both the decision model and the evaluation models. Now, the evaluation models are important based on decision models because the evaluations are based on those decision makers. Those decision makers are the ones who are actually evaluating those models, and that's why that paired relationship works. So in a project that we did on our online geodesign course called Models and Decision and Evaluation Modeling, we actually looked at a project in Tennessee. This is a study that proposed improvements of the Corridor K project along the Ocoee River Gorge. And it's a 24-mile section in the US 64. And the idea is to improve the project or improve the roadway deficiencies, support enhanced local and regional transportation networks, and enhance sustainable economic growth in the region. What you just saw here was a clip of that rock slide on the existing Corridor K project, or this is a 24-mile segment of US 64, where we actually have rock slip instabilities, which is actually causing a safety concern, obviously. And also, once that rock slide happens, it actually then blocks the road, and then economic development or economic transportation cannot occur. So there's actually a hindrance to that process. And so we're looking at this 24-mile road here in Tennessee here, and that's the idea that we're looking at. What are some of the things that we need to consider here when specifying the methods? So in looking at the decision models, how will the decisions be made and by whom? So these are the questions we're asking in the second iteration. What are the requirements for those decision makers? What do they need to know to make a decision, whether when they have proposed scenarios presented to them? What do they need to know about those scenarios? What are their evaluations going to be based on? Are they scientific evaluations? These might be based on wildlife habitats or water quality. So those evaluations would be scientific. Are they cultural norms? They could be qualitative, aesthetics, views, or cultural norms. Or are they legal standards, such as even the road alignments and transportation metrics? Ultimately, then we'll ask what visualizations are represented, visualizations or representations being needed by those decision makers. More on that later. And then when we're doing the decision model in that second iteration, we're refining the scope. We're refining what we understand about those, the people of the place. And so we developed a wheel for the people of the place that actually looks at different sectors that actually focus on different elements. So maybe it's the technical capacity. That was a question that just came up on our last after Kelleann's talk. What is the technical capacity of the stakeholder groups? What can they what do we need to be prepared for? And that could be the literacy of the community to understand, to engage. Maybe they don't all have internet access. Maybe they can't work on online forums and online aspects. Whereas they may not be able to look at plans. So that's a technical capacity. But understanding the people of the place even goes further in that. And we look at kind of 4 elements here. The client, who is the client when we're looking at the decision model, and that's with the dollar sign, who's paying for the project. The guiding coalition, these are people that are actually working on the project in some formal or informal way. And then we have the community stakeholders. Ultimately, everything is under the culture. And in our wheel, we have culture running around the entire thing, as culture influences every bit of these elements within. In our decision model, and looking at the Corridor K project, the client is the Tennessee Department of Transportation. They are footing the bill for the project. They are footing the bill for the study, and ultimately they will be incurring the construction costs. The guiding coalition, the formal ones, are the Appalachian Regional Commission. They've done a whole study on improving the Appalachian regional area. And then we also have the Federal Highway Administration, FEMA, and other agencies, official agencies that will be working in this project who also have a vested interest. The informal guiding coalition might be a citizens resource team. This one is a team that was set up by the Tennessee Department of Transportation to guide them in this process, but they're an informal guiding coalition in this project. And we also have community stakeholders. Now, while the citizens resource team includes community stakeholders, they're more the informal person of the guiding coalition, but the community stakeholders such as residents, business owners, recreational groups, and others that you're kind of defining as categories of users that you'd want to include in your planning process. So in our decision model, also at this stage, we'll also start looking at, or start figuring out a way to assess the core values of the community. So again, the second iteration is just specifying the methods to the project. And you would actually think about how you're going to assess those core values. In our project, we already had some core values derived from the Citizens Resource Team. But these core values are actually going back to Goldberg's 5 kinds of values that Steinitz talks about. Those are the cultural values, the authoritative, logical, rational, or emotional aspects to a project. And that's to help us understand the objectives and requirements, ultimately understand the objectives and requirements of the project. And in the Corridor K project, we had 9 community and economic values and environmental values that we addressed or looked at. Create new economic opportunities, protect and provide appropriate access to the Cherokee National Forest, continue to improve and restore water quality, and we increase access to both the Ocoee Lake and marinas, and we also see other bike opportunities, again, the access to Ocoee River. And then this is more of the cultural part, to preserve and create views, as well as preserve historical resources. And the last one being, increase unity for the Polk County, which one gets a little bit tricky when you start trying to identify other aspects to that last value. Moving on, we want to actually rank what those values are. So each stakeholder group, we actually want to think, what are their priorities for each one of those? And these were we have 8 values here, not the 9. But for a local business owner, maybe they're the business owner. Of course, the business owner in this case is tourism, fishing, and boating. They still look at creating new economic opportunities as being a higher value, and it works its way down. And these were just a ranked order that we did in our several courses, actually, as how these generated. And so you rank those values, and then we move on to looking at our evaluation model here. Now, we would be looking at, in the second iteration, of course, looking at the impacts and change models. But again, we're pairing this to the evaluation model. So we're going to look at what the evaluation model needs to look at. What are the measures for the evaluation? So we're looking at the factors derived, weighted according to decision makers. That's what we just looked at. Are they spatial, temporal, or quantitative or qualitative metrics? And are they scientifically or judgment based? Are they related to legal standards? We're also measuring the attractiveness and vulnerability or risk of these of this area or those elements. One really interesting way of mapping those values is a technique that was derived by Doug Walker and his team. Doug Walker actually had used to be the creator of Community Viz with PlaceWorks. And so what he looked at is value mapping for citizens-driven community by looking at the core value and developing the value elements, the value driver, and then that leads into the physical form indicators that you can then use in an evaluation model. And the way this looks at in his example is, family friendly might be a community core value that you're trying to strive for, or the community is recognized for family friendliness. And what's the value driver that defines or helps that define that? Maybe it's busy schools, many children, or sports teams. And then you have value elements. Now look at these value drivers. There's actually a qualifier here. So it's busy schools, not just children, many children, busy schools. In this case, many children. What supports many children? Family housing, entry-level jobs, recreational opportunities. How does these then go into physical indicators that you can use in evaluation? Are those homes affordable? Do those homes have sidewalks? Do we have jobs housing ratio? Look at that metric. Are there accessible facilities to support those recreational opportunities for those children, to have the many children? So these actually reverse order, they go through. And so looking at the value drivers, value elements, and physical indicators starts helping you start establishing what those evaluations might need to be in those evaluation models. In the example of the Corridor K, one of our students looked at recreational access. He believed that recreational access required camping, rafting and kayaking opportunities, biking and hiking. Now, he didn't put qualifiers on here, but then he qualified them on these drivers. Fishing amenities, and with the looking at rafting, kayaking, clean waterways, and there should be fishing amenities, and there should be rafting access that he then looked at into physical form indicators, such as separating from traffic congestion, noise pollution, protected aquaculture and habitats, or looking at those access points for those rafting. Now, some of these you may not be able to evaluate, to be honest, and some of these we'll start looking at as shared values or shared metrics from other values. So this is, you're only seeing a snippet of this one screen. We actually use a product called MindMeister. It's cloud-based mind mapping software. And there's all the values that are sitting up in here in the big tree. We can start looking at connections between not only this model, but other models to start understanding more metrics that we can use in our study, or shared metrics that we can use in our study. And so looking at this reverse order of going from the bottom to the top to ultimately to our data, as we talked about data as being representation and change, geodesign is decision driven. We need to know what the decision makers need to know to actually know how we're going to represent those models in the end. And both the decision models, talking about understanding this study, is the knowledge. So it's the local knowledge, it's also the professional knowledge, to actually link those decision models together. And those change models, the design changes, are linking to the data, or what data they ultimately need to create that project. But again, it's decision driven. And so the second iteration, again, looking at these things, how will the decisions be made and by whom? We should really articulate who those decision makers are, and which data is needed for the study and how it shall be represented. Too often we go into a project and just gather all the data that we have for that study area and start modeling what we have. A lot of it's inventory, and a lot of it then maybe some analysis, but ultimately we need to see what the decision makers need to know to start understanding what we need to model. And in the for the whole model, going in 3 iterations, we actually look at the sophistication of this model. So we talked about the data, but the process and impact model is actually the information. These are the information of it. The first 3 models in Steinitz' framework is the assessment, and the last 3 models is the intervention. In the 3rd iteration, performing the study, that answers the questions of what, where, when. We need to get the data organized for the appropriate technology and visualized over the space and time, implement, test process models, evaluate past and present conditions, and propose and simulate future changes. And we're going to look at assessing the impacts of those changes. So ultimately, we create our designs, look at what those impacts were to those said processes that we've already looked at. So we're looking at what changes, what did the changes impact of those processes? Those are the impact models. And ultimately compare those impacts of those changes and decide yes or no. That is Steinitz' framework, kind of a nutshell. So it really emphasizes that geodesign is decision-driven and not data-driven. Next, I guess we'll entertain some questions to that, and we'll move into Jesse's part of the presentation.
Great, thank you, David. And I will note that we've gotten a number of general questions that we'll just hold to the end that have come in during the presentation here. But I guess a question I have that also coincides with one that we just got in was, I understand the scoping process of what you were just describing, but how do you integrate that within the broader planning process, which would involve the stakeholders? I mean, do you kind of do this within that process, or do you share elements of what you're finding as you go through it?
Well, I would say it depends on the project for sure. I mean, in some cases, the members of the stakeholder group may be part of the scoping. And this is not just a siloed process where the designers are sitting back and pulling this all together. You would have inclusions. Now, Kelleann showed that Venn diagram of Steinitz is where you have information technologists, you have design professionals, you have scientists, and you have the people of the place all linked together in that Venn. That they can be a part of this scoping as well.
Okay. Did anyone else want to add to that, Kelleann or Jesse?
Jesse, did you want to jump in about that?
But the dissemination of information throughout the process in my applications has been critical, and something I'll cover in my presentation is how the dissemination of information and the gathering of information from stakeholders directly informs the entire process. All right, so I did a case study using geodesign for a real-world application, and kind of working through the process. I'm starting where the bulk of my project lived was in the stakeholder engagement and then the use of technology to augment the process. And so sort of distilled, the way I worked through was I engaged stakeholders and asked questions that answered my why iteration. And then I analyzed those questions to develop an understanding of their impact, and then gathered relevant data. Once I did that, I surveyed the stakeholders and I used the results to validate my findings, to ensure that my data that I'm using is in fact relevant. And one of the areas that I really had to analyze was the comprehensive plan. So we all use comprehensive plans, but they're updated every 10 years, and oftentimes they don't live, they're not a living document. In many cases, they kind of are produced and they sit on a shelf and are maybe pulled down when they're needed. So in this case, what I did was I evaluated the comprehensive plan and conducted a community survey to ensure that what was within the comprehensive plan was still in fact relevant. So that looked something like this. In a very small rural community, I was using the geodesign process. I analyzed the comprehensive plan and then conducted a survey in which I got 22 responses from diverse groups, which was good for this size of community. About 33% of them lived within the community, 52% recreated within it, and about 61% commuted through it, which is important because a large contingent of the process was ensuring that we minimized traffic demands within the new development that was potentially going to occur. As part of my data gathering expedition, again, I read and reread the comprehensive plan, but again, given that it was written in 2012, there was a question as to whether it was relevant. So I conducted the survey and used it to reveal the relevancy of the different goals and objectives and outcomes within the comprehensive plan. The way I did this was I formulated the survey in a way that created positive, negative, or neutral correlations between the questions and two questions within the survey. So each question had another paired question later on in the survey that would help to weight it as to whether or not there was a positive or negative outcome within the community. The survey is simply a snapshot in time. It was distributed throughout the community and was intended, again, to establish whether or not the values discovered through interviews and document research were accurate. As you can see here, I have two questions from the survey. The development of urban and commercial construction should use landscape in a way, or an architecture in a way to minimize visual impacts, was the first question within the survey. And 90% of the respondents agreed. And that was based on a value within the comprehensive plan where they had said that they wanted to do this to accomplish future development in a way that minimized visual impacts. But later on in the survey, when I asked the paired question of whether or not this had been implemented well within the community, a large contingent of the population disagreed. 18% had no opinion. So either they didn't understand the question or they weren't concerned with the outcome. But 58%, or a majority, felt as though this had not been implemented well, so it created a negative correlation. And what this meant was, with a negative correlation, it was something that I had to focus on within the development plan for this property that I was working on. From this survey, I was able to develop a dynamic workshop in which I used technology to help present my findings and then to help the community decision makers make decisions. And I used the survey to create awareness as well as design and planning, as well as create design and planning principles that would work well within the region. The workshop goals were to answer the why. It was to help develop an understanding of what planning tools best applied within the region, and to help the decision makers develop an understanding of how their development choices translate into metrics. So, for instance, in the particular area I was working within, one of their concerns was development would increase traffic demand. So I used some metrics which we'll see here in a moment to visualize how a specific type of development translates into traffic demand as a number. And I used the traffic engineering manuals to develop those metrics. So they're based in science, and they take the science and make it relatable to the decision maker. So in other words, I looked at what work has to be done. I looked at what has been successful within the community as well as what hasn't been successful. And then I was able to define how to work through the process. So in the dynamic workshop, I had to set the stage. So as I spoke about before, I looked at what planning tools would work well within the community, and then I put it into relatable context. So in this case, I demonstrated the spatial context by using something I call a rainbow of relativity, which is basically outlining how different development types fit within a spatial correlation to each other. And then I was able to take these land use types that you see in the small white boxes and show the decision makers where these would be inserted within the different developmental areas of the rainbow. This set the groundwork for the dynamic workshop. So the applicable principles here were smart growth, conservation subdivisions, and zoning methods. So taking those and explaining them in detail to the stakeholders and showing them how things fit spatially, I was able to use a computer program called GeoPlanner, in which the users or the attendees of the workshop are able to draw in land uses based on small increments of space, and they're able to derive various metrics such as school-age children per development type, residential population, area of retail, job capacity, and so on. As they draw land uses in, which you'll see here as I change screens, if you look in the center of the screen, you'll note that a new area of community or residential development is added, and we see that the school-age children increases from 198 to 253. So they're seeing in real time how their decision-making is impacting the community. So I gave them opportunity to create several scenarios. The first scenario is their optimal scenario, in which they wanted everything preserved as agricultural land, which just wasn't practical in this case. So we discussed the implications of having everything as agricultural land, and the users then developed a second optimal case scenario in which the land is divided into commercial, retail, residential, and industrial uses. From there, they developed a third scenario where they kind of had a little bit of everything they wanted. They had commercial retail, some agricultural preservation, and some industrial uses. This is what a potential collaborative scenario would look like. This is what they arrived at in their decision-making processes. And then as a final iteration through the process, this was their, about after 3 hours of design and negotiation between the different stakeholders and redesign. This was considered an agreeable design among all stakeholders. So we arrived at a level of consensus. Now, this isn't to say that this is to engineering scale and specification, but it's a starting point. It's a consensus for future development on this 500-acre piece of property. So using geodesign is an interesting process. You're able to change land uses, create land uses, and you see the metrics change. This is just to give you an idea of how dynamic the process can be. So in this case, I'm drawing a scenario. I'm drawing in some residential uses right now, and we'll see the school-age children population increase. We'll see the residential population increase. We'll draw in some industrial and commercial land uses, so we'll see about 2 million square foot of residential spaces added. And these are all based on metrics that are planning best practices, gross floor area ratios. You're looking at population based on housing type and size. And once you develop these scenarios, you're able to run comparisons in which you can see where people agree and disagree. So it's both scientific, both the scientific and the design perspectives here are essential, and a collaborative process. It's a collaborative process that fuses these and allows us to move forward. So that scientific process I'm talking about, these calculations that I build in based on these different metrics are displayed here. So if I'm looking at floor area ratios for population, or I'm looking at those to understand what kind of area of retail I'm generating, or in this case, very importantly, the trips per day that are generated from different uses, As they draw these in, these metrics change, and the decision makers get real-time feedback on what the potential impacts are. So here you see a comparison between the two preferred scenarios, the one at the top and the one at the bottom, and we're able to move forward with some design perspectives from there. So what we do is we then take into another technology called City Engine, and we're able to create 3D renderings and zoning volumes of what it would potentially look like if we took this and implemented it within the community. From here, we're able to run several analyses like view sheds, which I'll demonstrate here in a moment, as well as different visual perspectives. So we create a road network, we create a randomized parcel outlay, and we start assigning those land uses, as you can see here. So this is volumetric zoning. So per parcel, it shows a volume of area that could be used for a certain type of development, as well as open space. We insert these land uses, and we can run several analyses based on volume of viewshed. We're also able to create comparisons in which we're able to show comparisons of what a potential square footage would look like compared to another area. Now, I will point out there's a typo on this slide. This is supposed to be 2 million and 1 million square foot. It's a billion right now, but it's supposed to be 2 million and 1 million square foot warehousing, which is what they originally wanted to use the area for. They wanted to put 2 1 million square foot warehouses in here, or 1 2 million square foot warehouse, and still have recreational, open space, residential use, and commercial retail. And so what this demonstrates is that it's really would be really hard to have multiple warehouses on this potential parcel and still have those other compatible uses. The reason this is important is because it was directly informing how they were going to model their ordinances in the future and how they were going to cap warehouse square footage. They wanted to do an unlimited warehouse square footage in their ordinance. So we're able to display, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million square foot warehouse, depending on what a developer comes in and wants to do. Another way this is very valuable is we're able to, in real time, dynamically change things. So as they were talking about ordinances, they were talking about maybe developing some streetscaping ordinances, changing the height of buildings, and making bike lanes mandatory. And so what we're able to do here is we're able to display for them in real time what their decisions might look like on the ground. So we add bike lanes to their roads, we add medians, we can add street lamps, park benches, and various other aspects that they're considering making mandatory in their design specifications for residential development as well as town center development. So you see here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change it so that they have, instead of having a 3-story cap on residential development, they'll be able to have 5-story residential development, and you'll see in real time what that would potentially look like for their community. Just one moment. We can add some cars and make it look realistic. We take the buildings, we change their zoning to allow taller buildings, and now all of a sudden, their downtown looks a little bit more like our larger city. So we're able to do some other things here. We're able to create realistic buildings to demonstrate what a conservation subdivision might look like. We're able to run viewshed analyses to demonstrate how visual impacts, how the buildings in 3 dimensions impact the viewshed. So those areas in green at the top right-hand corner are areas that are visible when you're standing on a street. So if they chose to make their buildings taller in the ordinance, we could run an analysis and say, well, okay, well, if you were standing on 123 Main Street looking out over the horizon, you would be able to see these particular buildings because of that ordinance change. Other real case scenarios, we did in an Olympic Village in Portland, Oregon. We looked at changing the zoning and developing some realistic buildings to kind of demonstrate what it would potentially look like. So in this case here in the upper right-hand corner, we have a two-dimensional aerial image, and then looking around here, we have the zoning in 3 dimensions based on the maximum height allowed, maximum floor area allowed for residential, commercial, and multifamily dwellings, as well as what this potential university down here in the green area would look like with 2 Olympic venues, as well as 1 temporary Olympic venue. But it doesn't have to be 3D. It doesn't have to be complicated. Again, as Kelleann mentioned, it can be overlay analyses, which is what this is, looking at vulnerability and economic development within the Tahoe Lake area, looking at fire risk as well as economic development opportunities. And those areas in red are areas that are primed for economic development. Those areas in black are at high risk for some level of vulnerability or not suitable for economic development. So it doesn't have to be ultra complicated. The lessons I learned through the process of applying this on the particular case study I just spoke about, as well as several others in my professional career, are that we know, and you know, that the planning process is messy. Time is always a factor. People have very limited time, especially even when it's considered not quote unquote academic, which is something I run into that term a lot in the planning environment. But I still had positive results, and I was able to adapt to the people and their characteristics. What you may not already know is that technology is very complicated, and it's very difficult to anticipate the audience's expectations. So while whiz-bang technology works, you sometimes have to tone it down to a very relevant level. Sometimes understanding what that relevant level is can be complicated, and it's always better, in my experience thus far, to scale down a little lower than you think the audience might be prepared for. And then the next time you engage, you know, on another iteration, if you find that you can go a little bit more technical, then go in that direction. And that is all I have in terms of my presentation.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. And we have been receiving a number of questions throughout this process. We now have about 20 minutes to go through them. And if anybody wants to send in any other ones, we will be able to receive them. I'm going to just, I guess, start by asking Jesse, and we also have some, our presenters will be coming on screen here. But Jesse, a couple questions that came up toward the end when you were walking through your scenarios to start. When you were showing the different yields by changing the land use, are you also able to change the factors as well if you're getting input about what types of yields might be coming or realistic in different areas?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's extremely dynamic. The entire process is customized to the particular project. So if there was a metric that we wanted to consider that wasn't already in there, or if we wanted to change an aspect of how we were measuring a specific metric. So for instance, we weren't happy with a standard floor area ratio and wanted to approach it from a different number, we could do that in real time. It's extremely simple to set up.
Okay. Here's another question. Can you step us through the geodesign process through some of the visualization examples?
So in the iteration, the first 2 iterations, you would arrive at a point where you could gather the data and start assembling your metrics. And then once you go through I believe it would be the second iteration where or the third iteration, I'm sorry, where you're actually working through the engagement and trying to arrive at decisions, you would go into this process where you're actually designing and allowing people to see how their decisions impact the real world, and how these different decisions transform into metrics. And so what that allows for is you to arrive at consensus, which is in part where we are looking at how different people's how when we overlay different people's decisions, we can see where we have consensus and where we don't have consensus. Then later in the iteration, we start to actually physically design so that people can see what their decisions look like in a spatial context, in a 3-dimensional spatial context. And then once we arrive at the end of the iteration for decision making, we enable people to make decisions based on other visualizations like comparative visualizations or work through dynamic visualizations. But in a large part, the data process and visualization occurs in the third iteration, and a lot of the how you're going to create the data, how you're going to create the visualization, what's the best way to communicate with people, what are the stakeholders' desired goals and outcomes are all part of the first and second iteration.
Okay. We did get a... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just to further clarify that. So the question was a little vague, but one of the ways that sometimes it's characterized, the way the Steinitz framework is set up, is the first two passes through are setting up you actually doing the study. So you're gathering information about people and place, and then you're doing the study. So as far as graphics that pair with the process, it's not a one-to-one relationship exactly. But as Jesse said, most of the illustrations that he was showing was part of that third iteration where you're actually stepping people through the process and showing them, here's the values you all agree to, how the data, and this is if we start playing with these things, this is how you can see the widgets change. You can start to make these decisions. So I don't know if that helps explain it. Be better to whoever.
Yes, I want to, and to build on what Kelleann's saying, that's critically important in understanding that this is not GIS, that it's enabled by GIS, that these spatial visualizations, spatial technology and visualization we're looking at are really the culmination of the entire process, not the process itself.
Okay, so the clarifying question from the person who asked that was, so the first two stages of the geodesign process establish the parameters for the visualization.
That's right.
Okay, gotcha.
Yep.
A couple people asked what that software is.
So there's multiple softwares
Okay.
that I use, but the two primary softwares are going to be called GeoPlanner, which is an online webware type program, ArcGIS Online, and City Engine, which is a desktop application.
The example I showed from the workshop where that screen was up is called Geodesign Hub, and that's another web. A lot of these are web-based, so you can put the data in and play with it and then bring it to a meeting, or people can log in from wherever and participate also.
And the software that I was talking about was really facilitating the team collaboration. And we've used a couple of pieces of software. One I showed and one I didn't. One's Concept Board. It's an online collaboration tool, or it's a more online whiteboarding tool. And then we also have an online mind mapping tool, which was MindMeister.
Okay.
We've also had people just use fairly sophisticated Google spreadsheets for making weighting factors and things like that. So you don't have to, there's not a technology. We're talking about a process here that you can, and technologies are going to change. You can plug in these things as the new opportunity for doing these things evolves technologically.
Okay. So I guess one other question to follow up on the software was, I guess at one point you were kind of drawing together. Is that one of those softwares as well, or is that, which one was that?
GeoPlanner.
Yeah,
that's GeoPlanner. Okay.
That would be GeoPlanner, and the way that works is you can set up multiple user accounts, and in a public workshop you can have people drawing in land uses, and then they're called scenarios. So each person develops a scenario, and then you can overlay the scenarios and look for consensus.
Gotcha. So they're actually drawing directly on the maps with you?
Yeah, the digital maps.
It's real-time,
digital
dynamic,
maps, yes.
and directly on a map.
Geodesign Hub works the same way. You create
Gotcha.
different pieces and then you pull the pieces together into scenarios. And each of those are, the key is tying these with metrics. So it's not just, we do, those designers out there do a lot of bubble diagramming and stuff. These this is diagramming that's tied to what people want, and there's data behind those.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to go back to some of the more general questions then, and people can continue to submit them as we go forward here. So someone said, sounds like data is critical to geodesign. Do you know how much data is needed, and how do you get that data?
Well, on my conversation, I was talking about geodesign is decision-driven, not data-driven.
Okay.
And so how much data that you need is really relevant to what the decision makers need to know. And so if there is a lot of data needed by the decision makers, then there's going to be a lot of data needing to be gathered. And where you get that data is in a lot of different places, whether it's curated data from Esri or whether it's your local GIS resources for your municipalities or your counties. And there's also, I mean, Penn State hosts a data called Open Data Commons, and we have a lot of data that we have available for Pennsylvania and other areas. So you'll have to look for where that GIS, again,
David just froze.
where that data might be available. Did I freeze?
We were able to hear your response.
Okay, good.
Okay. Have you found that geodesign is scalable from small towns to big cities?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely.
Yeah.
I
Go ahead, Jesse.
I was just going to say, based on my experience, I've used it on everything from, recently here, I've used it on a very small rural town in Pennsylvania, and currently I'm using it on a very large statewide project.
I think it actually depends on also what you're actually studying in those areas. We've gotten down to, I mean, the regional town planning. You saw the area in Tennessee, so that was a pretty large southeastern part of Tennessee. But we've also done site level stuff just on the decision evaluation part. So if you're just breaking down the decisions and understanding what you need to evaluate, you can get pretty small on your study areas. Now that doesn't say that the models actually translate, such as an evaluation model. So a weighted suitability model obviously has some resolution issues at smaller scales, and so that'll also drive what you're able to study in the certain processes or certain methods.
What I think is really kind of to me, the most exciting part about geodesign, that once you understand the process of how to ask these questions, who to bring into the process, how to ask the questions to determine what you need and work through this, it really is applicable from anywhere from like a neighborhood scale all the way up to a whole, Spain used it to put new electric lines to a country scale. Corridors are really good use, no matter how long or how big they are. And yeah, it's really scalable. It's very exciting how diverse the uses for it.
Okay, so kind of in a related way, are there examples of county or regional programs that allow for the pooling of financial or technology resources to allow for this process to occur for smaller communities that may have limited resources?
Yeah, there are. In fact, depending on your state and depending on how the license structure is set up with Esri, some states have large enterprise systems which enable smaller local governmental organizations to actually piggyback on their enterprise system at a reduced cost so that they can get access to the softwares. And in other instances, if they can present a good business case that it's a scenario in which they're developing or using a geodesign process in a manner that's unique, they can approach Esri and sometimes, and not all cases, but gain access to the software at a reduced cost.
Yeah, it needs to be a coordinated effort, and everyone needs to make the case. But yeah, there can be strength in numbers.
Mm-hmm. Is there a network of geodesign practitioners?
It's growing. There's an annual Geodesign Summit conference that's held every year at Esri headquarters. This year was the 10th year. There's a growing number of people. There was a large international collaborative process with 70 or 90 different countries, all different scales of projects. And we can send that link. I don't know if there's a way to get information out to the participants, but we could send that link out. So there's a growing network of folks.
We also have a LinkedIn page.
We have a LinkedIn page, yes.
That's always good. We like to post our webinars on LinkedIn. And we have time for a few more questions if people submit them. Which of the mapping products are free that you are talking about? Are any of them available? Or are they all?
Jesse, did you mention a wiki map? I don't know if you
yeah, so there are, none of the programs I used are free per se. There are programs out there like Geodesign Hub that are free to an extent, but then if you want to use certain add-ins, they cost money. But based on the number of users you have, the cost can increase. So if you pool your users together into like a larger group, you can reduce your cost, as the previous question asked. But none of the software I used was free.
I know there's something called map.social. I don't know that there's a cost related to that, but that's a way of kind of a community mapping program to get people to, again, online process with icons and notes, and I think that has a cost to it. David, you talk about QGIS, is that?
I didn't talk about it, but there are some open source products out there that are actually pretty good. QGIS is a really great product. But even the software that I was talking about, there are entry points. There's basic versions of MindMeister, basic versions of Concept Board. Now those are just for the collaboration pieces. But if you're looking for modeling GIS, I can only think of QGIS and maybe others. Now Google has done their share with the Google Earth products and other add-ons to Google Earth, which are even Google Earth Pro is now free. So there are some tech capabilities in there, but they're not going to have you have some. They're not going to give you geoprocessing techniques that we're talking about.
Okay.
And I would just add that don't get hung up on the whiz bang technology is really great, but you can do this process using paper maps and so on and so forth. It's just you have to apply the collaborative nature of geodesign to that process. So it just takes some creativity to do that. But you could use Google Earth and do a geodesign process if you were creative and you worked through the whole design process.
Yeah, one of our participants just suggested Google Earth and also said that Viva GIS is also free and could be used for it.
And Google Earth just came out with their Google Earth Studio, which is actually an interesting product, but it's more about visualization animation. But I'm interested in seeing what they're going to do with Building Maker and Google Earth Studio to see what you can do with it.
I think actually that's a really important point, because in fact, one of our colleagues, the Manitou Springs project, that project had been laying a desire from the community to go forward with that for over 2 decades. And it wasn't until they had even had designers working on it and doing nice drawings and talking to people. It was nice visualizations. But until they really got down to what the key issues were, what those metrics help determine success, and they could try it out and draw it up, after about 3 or 4 months of engaging in this, they found success. So just visualizations that's not geodesign, and that's not going to do it for you. It has to be tied to people understanding what they want, what are the parameters, and what are the decision issues. Then tie those to, they can see how the choices, how well those are being addressed. That's it. You can't just have visualizations. Otherwise, you can. Right. That's just design. That's a nice way of doing stuff.
Kelleann said it, I think, in her presentation, talking about negotiating that change, because there's going to be compromises, and these compromises don't have to be visual. They're just to prioritize what the needs are. Can just be on pen and paper, and I think that's the crux to this whole thing, this whole process, and understanding that it's informed by the stakeholders, it's informed by science, it's informed by design, and that only one element of that then is for information technologists, for the GIS, that can be augmented.
Okay. Here's another type of question. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are a global call to action. SDG 11, Smart Cities, has many indicators that are relevant and apply. Have the SDGs been considered in geodesign discussions?
Absolutely. In fact, we were thinking about, when we have spare time to try to go forward with that. But yes, absolutely. And I mentioned the example from the American Planning Association. This is back to a question I realized I don't know if you finished answering about where do you get the data.
Right.
Jesse mentioned he used transportation information from a manual, and actually we worked to adjust that a little bit. Yes, the Sustainable Development Goals are really important series of metrics that you can use and are very applicable to geodesign.
Okay. What is the typical time frame for a geodesign project to go from start to finish?
Good question.
Yeah, that really depends on the project.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned with the
Yeah.
case with a student in, and became a real project in Managed Springs, I think altogether about 6 months. But it had been, community had wanted it for over a couple of decades. The thing that's kind of cool about is you can iterate scenarios more quickly and make choices more quickly. So in some sense, it moves you through the negotiation decisions faster. I know sometimes people think, oh, involving all the community and that's going to take so long, and so many planners and designers just that one community meeting and that's enough, and it's actually not enough. You might have to put a little bit more time at the beginning to really find all the right stakeholders and decision makers and engage them and really get to the key information. But then it's going to accelerate the process later because you've got what you need and you can weigh all these choices and look at options more quickly. So it's maybe kind of reversing how the process has been typically working, I would say. But again, it depends on the scale and the size of the project. 6 months or 4 months, I don't know, 2 years, it varies.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to, sorry, Jesse, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I'll just put it into some real world context for you. I was brought in on a project that had been sitting dormant. It was a resiliency project, and they were really having a hard time getting it off the ground because they couldn't get consensus on their resiliency projects that they wanted to implement within the community to achieve resiliency. And I applied the geodesign process. I applied a small section of it, the stakeholder engagement section of the geodesign process, and was able, essentially using that to not only jumpstart the resiliency planning process, but also accelerate it so that it was completed a month before it was supposed to be completed versus being 3 or 4 months behind schedule as it was projected to be. So it was an accelerant to a process that had been approached from a very traditional planning perspective.
Well, Jesse, you said exactly what I was going to segue to you, and that is we don't know how long it is, but hopefully it's faster than the traditional process. I started doing, in my professional work, was working on a large-scale highway project. It was not per se a geodesign study, but at the same point that there was a long-scale process over 10 years, if not 20 years, that they were planning this project, and they could not reach consensus. And they didn't have the instruments in there to reach this consensus, even though they had facilitators. Had we used this geodesign process, I'm confident that we would have had more consensus on the project.
Okay. Well, with that, we've run out of time, so I appreciate everyone's submitting questions. We had a few we weren't able to get to, but I do appreciate everyone's participation. So this concludes our webinar, Geodesign Using Data Transparency and Community Voices for Enhanced Land Use Planning. I'd like to offer a big thank you to our presenters for a great presentation and to all those who attended. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on the smartgrowth.org website later this week. You'll be able to find it on our webinar archive page. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and our weekly e-newsletter for details on other future webinars, including one that we'll be doing with Smart Growth America on Opportunity Zones on June 4th, as well as a few others that we are planning. Have a great day.